So welcome everyone. Kim and I are back here and we're going to carry on some of our dialogues, and we're quite explorative, and we're also just getting to know each other. So and I'm learning a lot from Kim, and I'm mostly here to learn actually, and particularly interested today to learn more about the field of all these celestial objects that Kim, you're really good at. You've gone into a really deep contemplation and exploration of them, and so I'm just introducing you again as, like, one of my teachers here to learn from, as well as exploring all kinds of subjects that are connected to human design and gene keys and the field of consciousness and the things that we're into. So it's just lovely to be back, and
yeah,
I think we're going to pick up on creativity, are we?
well, we were thinking to talk about 2027, and we kind of started in with the whole idea of magical thinking and how it got left behind by the Enlightenment period, where science was king, and what we lost in that process. And I love how, and we're kind of starting here because I had to stop our conversation because we were getting too excited and say, let's stop here and start recording. So we're going to try and do a little, recap to make sure everyone's up with us here. But we were talking about magical thinking, and you said something that I just wrote down because I thought it was great. You said playful thinking. And when do we get so serious that everything has to be kind of, backed up with science, basically? So do you want to recap a little bit on the magical thinking thing and where you're at with that?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I was saying how I had looked I kind of looked into that spiral dynamics model that some, I don't know, a decade ago or something, had a big impact when Ken Wilber and those other teachers brought that out as a way of looking at the evolution of consciousness, of awareness, moving through these levels and layers. And I'm not a big kind of fan of that model, although it's really interesting, but it's had a big impact, I think, in the sort of spiritual thinkers. And I looked at that, and it has these sort of layers of evolutionary awakening, I guess, the way in which the human mind has sort of like developed and evolved over the millennia. And so it has these different colors, and even though it looks like an up down, it's not intended as that way, as I understand it. I think it's intended as a kind of, it gets broader. They're almost like circles, concentric circles that contain each other. And there's this really great statement, I think, about transcend and include. Those three words are key. I'm not sure that it always does transcend and include, but that's its intention. Anyway, so looking at that ladder, I noticed that the expression magical thinking was right at the bottom, in one of the bottom tiers of, so that when there was this notion that as humanity has evolved, we've evolved through the kind of primal gods and ancient religions, and then magical thinking came, and superstition, and all those tribal ways, as they're kind of described, and then they evolved up through kind of through the ages, through into the religions and other things. So there's this, and then eventually at the top, or in the middle, or at the highest, is seen sort of the non-dual unified consciousness idea, right? And so that's the sort of top, and which I'd like to challenge, actually.
Yeah, well, we talked about that last time, didn't we? And whether that was actually the place that we all really wanted to get to.
Yeah, so I'd like to kind of, but what I really felt, particularly about the magical thinking as an expression, maybe we should qualify what we mean by that a bit.
Yeah.
Is I think we need that back right near the top, if there is a top, or right in the middle. So if we're re-envisioning a kind of new spirituality or a new spiritual paradigm, then I feel like that needs to be one of the fundamental pillars, is the ability to think playfully and to kind of extend our ideas you know, to challenge everything. And so that's, I think you and I both are kind of rebels like that. We like to challenge. You've challenged human design. I've challenged human design. You know, and kind of just challenge wherever we find like some piece of dogma. And I also even I'm always challenging myself as well, because things I wrote in my Gene Keys book 10 years ago, I would now look at them and go, oh God, did I really write that? Because we're evolving all the time, and so I think we need to constantly be kind of reinventing, and so magical thinking is really that kind of playful. It's not reactive or sort of revolutionary. It's just playfully trying to tease out truths, or central truth, a central truth that I think it's I think it's all about freedom. I mean, ultimately, I think that's why it's important for me in my work, because of this change, that the great change, I call it, which is represented by this 55th gene key, this freedom that's coming. And I think freedom has to be at the core of our new spiritual paradigm, so that we don't get rid of what's come before, we integrate it up and in. And I think that magical thinking, which particularly has been connected to the indigenous cultures of the world, you know, whether that's right or wrong, I think you know, our kind of, we maybe view them as thinking magically, and you know, because we've forgotten what that is, you know, to think in a more merged sort of intuitive way, feminine way, you could say. And so I feel like that's what I'd really like to explore. And it's also connected, of course, to the creative imagination, creativity, which we talked about last time. So maybe that's like brings us up to date a bit, I hope.
And it's interesting that when you talk about it being a more feminine way of thinking, because I think if we go back to a time before, and I kind of shudder a little bit about using the term patriarchy, but I mean, we do live in a patriarchy, so the more, if we look at, just going to go to the science for a minute, if we look at quantum physics, one of the big problems with quantum physics is it's very feminine. It kind of harks back to magical thinking in a way. Ken Wilber got the idea of that magical thinking, I think, from a Piaget, I think is how he pronounces his name, who was a child development person. I don't know if he was a psychiatrist back then or whatever, but he said that what happens to children is that they have this natural way of being in the world, which is very playful, and that they think that they influence things when they think them, that, you know, it influences the world, but then they grow up and grow out of that. And so my understanding is, I think Ken Wilber said in an interview that he got the idea of that from Piaget, and that why do we grow out of that? Why do we grow out of it? You know, you said something about why do we have to be so serious? And I think that's really at the crux of all this, that we've gotten incredibly serious about having to prove things, having to shore up things. And imagination is such an incredibly creative tool, and we've lost our capacity, I think, largely for imagination. And when you talk about freedom, that's what I think of, the freedom to imagine, and the freedom to act on what I imagine, the freedom to create what I imagine. How does that relate back to your idea of freedom?
Absolutely. I think that's what I mean. It is that childlike innocence of exploring, you know, I think we mentioned last time, like the toddler that just kind of is sort of rushing from one place to another with just utter freedom. And I think, you know, there's boundaries, you know, but that even there's freedom to play within the boundaries, or to kind of check the boundaries, or to, you know, smash the boundaries, but just like and
but driven by play, don't you think? Like the motivating force is play, not like, oh, my parents think I
Not,
should be walking by now, so I better get up and walk.
Yeah, or doubt, you know, it's like
Yeah.
science is in a way driven by doubt, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
In a good
if science were driven by play,
yeah,
how different
yeah,
the world might be, you know.
yes.
And sometimes scientists probably are driven by play. But yeah, it's a kind of the problem. The tool is wonderful, science, but it's like, how are we using it?
So we've got these trinaries. We've got this, you know, the superstition / religion, and you know, I mean, and then we have the science, which is great because we have an idea, and then we've got a way to test it out. It kind of objectively, not totally objectively, but kind of objectively. So that's been great. I mean, you know, we've put people in rockets and sent them to the moon. You know, we're talking to each other from across, you know, different sides of the world. So it's been great. So what we have now is, I think, a coming together of many, many, many different things. I think the masculine and the feminine, I mean, I prefer to kind of think of active and response. What's the word I'm trying to think of? Active and receptive principles coming together. You know, all of those dualities coming together. And what do we do with them when we get that synthesis of those things? How do we live as humans with the synthesis, rather than saying, oh, well, I'm in this polarity, or, you know, I'm a religious person and therefore I have to believe the Bible and not science? Or how does it feel when we start to say, I can be playful and believe these things because in me that feels completely true. I've got nothing to back it up but my playful imagination. No proof of this.
And a sense
you can feel the truth of it as well. And so
isn't that true? Isn't that the key there, in a way, that you've hit upon, is that, like, there are different ways of evaluating truth, and maybe truth is also, we should differentiate it from fact, you know, because facts change. Facts can be disproved and then replaced by new facts, you know, as we know from the evolution of science. You know, something that was like we thought it was is now completely changed, and probably will be again.
And so even truth changes. Do you think truth changes also in a way? It evolves.
Partly, maybe. I mean, there are certain. What I'm talking about is like cellular truth, let's say, call it.
Well,
so,
can I poke at that for a bit? Because you know what, I was thinking about human design, and I was thinking about your book, and when that's a long time ago that you first when did you first publish the Gene Keys book?
It was like 2009, I think.
Okay. And so in the time since then, the 12 years or so since then, you've changed a lot. Presumably you've grown and learnt new things in that time. And I would imagine, my stuff's all online, but I go back and there's stuff in there, I think, that I can't believe I nailed that 10 years ago. Like, I can't do any better than that now. But there's other stuff I think that's not true anymore. That doesn't feel right anymore. And I imagine when you produce a creative work, you have to be prepared to leave it behind and let it stand as it came out and keep moving. And I think what happened with human design was it came out and it didn't keep moving in a way. It kind of came out and got stuck. And so there's a lot of movement possible, a huge amount of movement possible with human design. But I just was thinking about you as the creator of that work. And would you say in that sense that truth there's been some, things around
depends
it?
It depends how you qualify it again. Like, yes, there's sort of, what I sometimes find when I contemplate something I wrote 10 years ago or 15 years ago, is I'm quite surprised that there's truth in it, but it's like the way it's described or explained is perhaps narrower than I might explain it or understand it now. But there's a kind of grain of truth to it that seems like, that really kind of still resonates. It's the style that maybe changes and becomes softer or more fluid.
More freedom.
Yeah, I think so. There's a whole problem with using words at all, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean.
Well, it's like in my Gene Keys. Well, it's like in my Gene Keys book, I chose all these words, and then they're kind of, those are the words, and the book is like circles around those words. But if you change any of the words, that whole meaning,
you can't.
No,
you can't go back and change them. This is what I was thinking about. It's like you give birth to something, and there it is, and it has its own life. It just has its own life then, because people start to own it in their own way and do what they do with it. So
it's a strange phenomenon.
Yeah. So we were talking about 2027, and you actually talk about the 3 dates. The first one, hang on, let me check, because I wasn't, the Harmonic Convergence, which was 87, and also the year that Ra first downloaded the Human Design System. And then the 2012, which you referred to as the melodic resonance, which was the birth, you said. So I like that. It was kind of how did you experience 2012? Did you experience that as a birth?
Not particularly. It kind of came and went rather quietly.
I know. It was like, that was it.
Yeah. And life was just going on. And actually, I had quite a lot of crisis going on at that time anyway, so I wasn't that focused on.
Was that you giving birth to something, do you think?
Inside me, yes, definitely. A new me, for sure. More integrated, grounded, compassionate version of me. And so, there was. I think, so those 3 dates seem like markers or a time period that seems quite special, perhaps like a seeding time period between 1987 and 2027. So that's why I sort of named them. And also I like 3s, and they felt interconnected. And they seemed like musical, which they gave them these musical, so Harmonic Convergence, which wasn't the name, which was the name that that came from the Mayan revelations. And then Melodic Resonance was this kind of development of that theme, where you have the melody, the melody is maybe more, for me, I always saw the melody as more about all the different human melodies. Like human design, like every time if you look at a design, there's a melody. That's like, the melody is the story or the song of that, or the color, the specific kind of uniqueness of that individual. So the melodies for me are humanity, are all the colors of humanity. And then the final 2027, I named that Rhythmic Symphony, which is a very different feel to it. It's like suddenly there's a drum beat that's kind of introduced, and it brings the whole of humanity as one together. And so it's the emphasis is then off the kind of individual melodies and into like a symphony where all those melodies are kind of coming together in a higher harmony. So there's this sort of magical thinking in this period. And of course I'm aware of the danger of setting dates, and then everyone like builds apprehension and expects something to happen, and often nothing happens much. Although there's like, I think they're the markers, aren't they? They're the markers for change.
1987, I mean, not so much I looked at the human design transits for that time, and there's very little that I would point to and go, oh wow. And that sometimes happens. And then other times, like now, we've got Pluto, Saturn, and Jupiter in 61, and Uranus in the 24, which is like beyond extraordinary, really, this year. And that mostly that doesn't, like the Uranus part does not show up in astrology. So, it's
so
in the design chart, view. But it just gives a different So there wasn't really anything in the 87 chart, although the astrology chart was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. We had all of that time when Neptune was going through all those Aquarian solar plexus gates, 2006 through to about 2012, I think, maybe around that time. And that we had all that terrorism, and that was a really profound time. So I think, you know, Neptune doing that and going through all the gates that relate to the 2027 shift. So Neptune went through all of those over those years, and they were big, but nothing like now. Like now's pretty full on.
Yeah. And then we had, didn't we have the discoveries of all those?
2005.
2005.
So what happened in 2005 that I think is really relevant to 2027, and I came into human design in 2003, but I didn't start actually doing anything much till 2004. And then within a year of that, all these new planets got discovered, and I was like, "Oh, let's go look at those."
Yeah. You came in specifically with that.
Yeah, I really think that was
your coattails.
Yeah, absolutely. It was like, well, why not? Why are we not including them? So the thing that's important here is the 2027 event is the Ra described the shift from and Richard, please correct me because you know more about this than me, and I can never quite get all of this in my head. But the shift from the 7 to the 9-centered being, which is all about Uranus, you know, the Uranus triggered this in 1781, blah, blah, blah. And what happens in 2027 is specifically Pluto returns to the position it was in at the moment that Uranus was discovered. And it does that going back or going into gate 41. Which is the start codon in the only start codon in the human design chart.
Yeah. Which is quite an extraordinary piece of symphony.
And remember too that when Uranus was discovered, we hadn't discovered Pluto, it was discovered later.
Right.
So it actually wasn't discovered then, which is quite interesting in itself.
So it was hidden.
Yeah, which Pluto likes to hide. And then what happened, so I think that's incredibly significant. And then what happened in 2005 was people might remember that Pluto got demoted to dwarf planet, which might seem a bit strange, but why that happened is important. And it's because we have so much better equipment now, yay science, they were able to discover a whole lot of planets, and these are planets in our solar system, so not what they call exoplanets, which are elsewhere, and that, you know, one day someone, not me, I don't want to go, might want to go live there because they're okay for us to live on. Apparently no, thank you. But these are actually in our solar system, orbiting around our sun. But the Eris, her orbit is 12 to 13,000 years. Oh no, sorry, Sedna, 12 to 13,000 years. So that she goes way out into deep space and then comes right back inside Pluto, and maybe perhaps even inside Neptune, I'm not sure. So
that must be the deepest orbiting planet.
There's a couple that they haven't named, and they haven't given them planet status. She's by far the largest orbit of any named planet, like designated planet. And the others are more like 200 to 300 years, around that 200 to 300 year mark. So they're all kind of around a bit more than Pluto. So the reason Pluto got changed was that they actually realized that, because Pluto had always been a bit of an oddbod and hadn't really fitted in very well, and what they discovered was that Pluto was exactly like these other planets and nothing at all like Neptune or Uranus or any of the planets that we know and love. And these planets they called them Plutinos because they are all just like Pluto. So Pluto actually opened a doorway for us to expand. So think about the expansion of consciousness, where up until the time where Saturn was the furthest planet out, you know, Saturn bounded our consciousness. that's 28 years. And now then we went to Pluto, which was 248 years, and then out to Sedna, 12. Like that's the amount of consciousness, that
expansion
that we have available to us now, which is just extraordinary,
mind-blowing. Yeah.
And if you think about when Uranus was discovered, we had the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution, and the Age of Enlightenment, was upon the world. When we got Neptune, we had the Theosophists, the spiritualists. That huge
East meets West.
Yeah, East meets West. Yep. And then when Pluto came in, we had the atom bomb and psychotherapy. Searching. Finding what's hidden, searching inside the psyche. So think how much they change things, and now we have this huge expansion. And go on.
Yeah, and all these. I mean, it's like Pluto opened up this treasure chest, right, of all these other objects, planets. Do we call them planets, by the way?
Yeah, they're planets.
They are planets, yeah, because I've heard them called planetoids, whatever that means.
The terminology is very, very confusing, but there are they're planets.
Yeah, okay, so let's call them planets, because they are. So, yeah, but there's hundreds of them, right?
Yeah, there are, but not all of them.
Are they different from asteroids?
Yeah.
Can you make that distinction?
Mostly. So look, the thing is, they're not all dwarf planets. There's only about 5 designated dwarf planets. And they are Sedna, Eris, Makemake, Haumea, and I know I will have missed one or so. But there's only
Lilith one.
Sorry?
Lilith, is that one?
No.
No, that's an asteroid, is it?
She's an asteroid.
Okay.
And there's what they call dwarf planet candidates, which means they probably meet the criteria, but they just haven't kind of ticked them off on the list yet. So there's some others like Quoa, and so there's more there, Ixion. But there's a few very specific dwarf planets, including what we talked about just before, Ceres, or Cirrus, as some people pronounce it. She was probably originally with Pluto, and she split off and went and tossed herself into the middle of our solar system, and she orbits between Mars and Jupiter, and she's actually a planet. So, I mean, on the software that I have, she's, all these things show up on the chart.
Right.
And she's
so you
important.
Wouldn't, so in a human design context, you would really want to have Ceres in there. Yeah. Or even in a Gene Keys context, you might see where that landed. Yeah.
Now, I want to tell you about these outer planets, because you'll love this bit. All of those planets have been named for creator gods from indigenous cultures.
Yeah.
So they have the...
Isn't that in itself interesting, given how we began this conversation?
Absolutely. I was saving that bit. I hadn't told you that bit. I was saving that. So let's drop back to magical thinking for a minute, because what we've got is the return of some strange combination of galactic deep space and indigenous creator energy. And Pluto's the doorway for that. And in 2027, Pluto is going to open that doorway by landing in the start codon. So I've talked a lot about the global human, but what I think we're getting to now is some kind of galactic human. I think we've kind of done our human oneness, and we're going to move out beyond that in terms of our consciousness.
Yeah. So beyond the species mind and into the galactic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or
to see what we used to call fleet consciousness. I don't know. Do you know that phrase?
No, I don't know that phrase.
So where we actually realize that we hold a lot of different, like Andromedan energy. I have very strong Andromedan energy. The Lemurian, but specifically, and so we would start to look at what what aspects and roles do I carry that come from outside of our solar system, outside of our, what's going to wake up in our DNA?
That's really interesting. Yeah. So it's almost like in my world, I love to find correspondences. So gene keys are one of my ways of doing that. To look at, well, let's use this map, even though it's quite a limiting map. It's only got 64, but then what might that code correspond to in the star field, for example, and that kind of, because everything, it feels to me that everything, that's what the ancients did, is they're up as above so below. They began to kind of see the correspondences between, like when I'm wandering through the beautiful nature of Devon down here, and especially at this time of year in spring, I'm looking a lot at the little wildflowers that come out, that pop out, and as the spring comes in. And I sometimes wonder, like, that little specific wildflower, what star it relates to or resonates with, because there's stars. I think it was Steiner that said that, there's like the stars and the flowers are almost like reflections of each other. They're doing the same thing. And so I that's part of the magical universe for me, is like finding correspondences and connections. Like you said, you have Andromedan energy. I think that's an example of like correspondence, like that you feel that is a cellular truth probably for you. Otherwise you wouldn't have found it. But you're never going to be able to prove that with science. Well, not never, but it's like that's a good example of like Pluto's, what it opens up for us, doesn't it? Like the mixing of like magic and truth. In the body, grounded in the body, and meaning.
So let's go back to the idea of imagination and the coming together of the polarities, because and I want to just talk about masculine and feminine, even though I kind of feel like we're past that now, and it's old to talk about that. But this linear thinking that we've all gotten used to, and having to prove things, and looking back on something like, magical thinking as being superstition. So I notice on our current affairs shows, sometimes they talk about something like homeopathy, which was the only thing that got me well when I was sick for 3 years, and homeopathy was what got me well. So but they would say, placebo effect or something. And there's no way for our current science to assess the effects of it, and so it's put down as superstition, and you're an idiot if you believe in it, and that kind of stuff. But just to come to that, I just need to have a look at this, because I need to get my brain back in this mode. The idea of meaning is, I think, incredibly important to how we move forward, because we have to use our imagination to do that. We have to actually be able to come back to, and this is gate 41, the gate of fantasy, where Pluto is going to be. And I think this is the ability to imagine what's the next journey I might, go on. What's the next exploration I want to do, or the next, but there's a hidden truth in that, and we can only understand what has personal meaning for us. So we've got the active principle that can go on the journey, but it's the feminine, the receptive, that goes, does this have meaning for me? Does this have purpose for me? Is there a hidden truth here that I can reveal about myself and the world if I go on this journey? And I think we do that through synchronicity. And if I can explain what I think of as synchronicity, and I want to talk about the Andromedan thing. This is many, many, many years ago. And I was doing some channeling, and I knew I was getting all of this information from, ETs. And I was like, but I didn't know it was ET necessarily, but who are you? Who are you? Tell me who you are. And they said, so I was actually writing, we're from Andromeda. And I was like, well, yeah, you might say that, but, why should I believe you? And I was actually staying in a little motel on a trip somewhere, And I drove in the morning, I drove out from the motel and onto the main road, and there was this massive billboard and it said Andromeda Engineering. And it was the first thing I saw when I drove out onto the main road. And I was like, oh, hardy ha.
Yeah.
You know, I think that, and what Jung says is, if it has meaning for you, then that's truth. And someone else might go, oh, don't be ridiculous. That sign's always there. You just saw it. But I knew something in me recognized the truth of that. And it's that sense of our capacity for personal meaning. I think that's what's missing in our ability to take the dream and create something from it. How does that tie in with your thinking about it?
It ties in really well with my kind of, well, this notion of how I use the art of contemplation, you know, because contemplation is a journey that helps you find that freedom to make those connections, because you contemplate something and then it sinks deeper and deeper and deeper. But as you're contemplating it, it comes alive, even you kind of realize, am I actually contemplating this, or is this something that's just
contemplating
kind of
me?
Something contemplate. Yeah, exactly. Because then the billboard comes and you're like, who's doing this? and so so what happens through the art of contemplation is things get revealed from within, and then there are signposts literally that kind of confirm them, right? And they create the kind of link. Like, I'm sure when you saw that billboard, you had a cellular rush of some form that then confirmed it. You know, it's like, there's your revelation. It was, and that moment of like, bing, is the truth. That moment is the confirmation of the truth that was building in you. And so these epiphanies and revelations are like, they're emerging as we explore, you know, with our, you know, free minds and hearts, you know, but we've got to kind of allow ourselves that playfulness to really keep stretching and moving beyond these parameters that we set for ourselves, isn't it? And I think that's why I'm really inspired by this notion of Pluto opening up this kind of whole new realm through all these other, I mean, it's almost, it's quite overwhelming. Like, if you're looking at a standard human design chart, or if I'm even looking at Gene Key's profile, and I'm like thinking, well, what about all these thousands of other objects? Where it's like, I can't just begin again. It's like,
you don't, but there's,
so you don't know. So but you can't kind of let that, you have to just go, okay, let's just open the box and see where we go.
This is where the organic process is important, because I have people write to me and say, I just want to explore my Lilith, for example. And then you look and you see, oh, Lilith is transiting right on top of their moon at the moment. So Lilith speaks to them and says, go and have a look.
Yeah.
Go and play with, you know, where I am in your chart. I always tell people just to go with what comes up for them, because then it's alive.
Yeah.
And then you're interacting with that field.
And that's a very different approach from having a set kind of sequence or thing or chart, or, you know.
Can't do it that way.
You know, so although that has its kind of, you know, good things, but it's a very different approach. But I can see how it's like a completely new approach. I also feel like there's no way any one person can master all those, because there's just too many of them. So the only way we can kind of grasp all of that is if we all explore it, because then as you said, everyone just goes, well, that's what I'm drawn to. I'm going to go and explore that vein of truth, and I might spend a whole life just exploring that.
And this comes back to my global immune system idea, which is that each person is really only here to sit with their surroundings and what's alive for them. And we have to trust that everyone's doing the same, and each person has their own patch of ground, in a sense.
And in a way that, sorry, go ahead.
And so that frees me up from having to worry about, oh, should I be doing something about that, or that's bad, or no, just stay with what's alive for me, because that enlivens my field and everything I connect with. but there's a lot of trust needed in that, because I need to relax and trust that everyone else is going to pop and start doing the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's like, that we earlier said, well, what in the kind of unified consciousness field that's supposedly at the top or in the middle.
Yeah.
What happens when you go kind of through if that's a wormhole or something? What happens when you go through that wormhole? Don't you come out into another even bigger vista?
Why is that the end?
Why is that the end? Like, surely that's the beginning, in a way.
Yep.
Isn't that what the 41 is about? Like a new beginning?
Totally.
Isn't that we're going to go through a wormhole in 2027 of some form, and we're going to come out with this like, whoa, anything's possible now. And that's in terms of spirit, some kind of consciousness.
Yeah.
I don't know what on the surface is going to be going on, but I can only imagine a breaking down.
Yeah.
It seems like.
Well, because that's how it always works, doesn't it, Richard? We have these cycles. A day is a very small cycle for each one of us, and we have a Jupiter cycle of 12 years, where we have this opportunity and get to do something with it over a 12-year period. And we have these, much bigger cycles as well. And globally, we have these, Pluto cycles of 248 years, which we're going to, have this new one. Any kind of cycle, it gets to the end and it's worn out, we're done, and it starts to break down because the seed, the energy of the seed, the vitality of the seed is too strong for the old, totally. For the old pot, in a way, if I can use a Gate 47 metaphor. And it cracks the pot open because the plant needs the freedom to grow into the new shape. And that's where we're at now. So I think there's a lot of fear, but we need to focus on the seed and give the seed the freedom that it needs to grow into the new shape and the new form, and to create the new cycle, the beginning of the new cycle.
And therefore, and the new human, that's
going to
emerge out of that seed.
Yeah. And even when I first started doing human design, my first tagline was a new way to be human. And I had no idea what that meant. Like, I didn't know what that meant, but that was a truth for me. That I could I couldn't articulate it at all, even, at that time. No one asked me, thankfully.
Yeah. So it's an amazing period we're in now, as we're kind of in a 7-year cycle leading up to 2027.
Yeah.
And and you're saying that you're seeing like amazing kind of celestial connection, especially with the 24 and the 61. And tell us about that. What do you see with that?
Well, what I see is a little bit of what I was talking about, which is that so Uranus has been in gate 27 down in the sacral leading to the spleen, and the adjoining gate there is the 50, which is the beginning of a new era. And specifically, that's about taking better care of each other. And I talked last time about this moral arc of evolution and how Darwin was saying that humans are all about actually learning to take care of each other, to have this, and not moral in a cultural sense, but moral in some kind of fundamental evolutionary truth kind of sense. And so when Uranus was in 27, it was teaching us that each one of us has our own unique and individual way to take care of ourselves, and that we needed to, to find not to sacrifice ourselves for the good of the others, but to actually take care of ourselves, and also in that be able to take care of other people as well. So there was a really big shift I noticed with that. It's gone up to 24 now, and at the moment Pluto is there and Uranus is there. So they're not together the way they were in the 60s. They're actually making a channel. So it's an electromagnetic, which is a different kind of energy. But that is really about people finding their own relationship with truth. And gate 61, or, gene key 61, I don't know how close it sits to this, but the idea is that we have a huge amount of ways of knowing the truth, each one of us. just our felt sense in our body. Or like you said, when I looked at that billboard that with Andromeda on it, how did I know? How did I know that that was the truth for me? What happened in my body that signaled to me that's true? Some kind of felt sense in my body gave me that signal. So we all have these multiple ways of understanding what our truth is. As I think, as things break down a bit, we need to be really anchored in what's true, and to be able to stay really calm and present with the seed as it unfolds, because we're midwifing this change. We're there holding this change, and we're holding it through staying in touch with our own unique truth as we step away from groupthink, believing that we can only survive if we fall into line with other people, thinking that we're crazy if we get it wrong, which is what's going to happen when Neptune goes into the 36. It's going to be all this like, you're crazy stuff. Well, no, actually, I'm so anchored in my trust in my own sense of what's true that I'm just this force for mutation in the world, force for creation.
I love that. That's really powerful. But I agree. I think we do need that really strong anchor. And it's an interesting anchor, like to anchor yourself in the magical.
Yes.
Isn't it?
The possible, and the impossible as well.
I think that's why through my work with Gene Keys, having these words for the cities, for these like almost like eternal aspects of our consciousness, which is what they represent. In a way, they are a bit reflective of all those new planets and things that have been discovered, like all the possibilities of the galaxies, of the even the universe itself, like other universes, other times, other epochs, future and past, like even things outside the space-time continuum,
Which
like
is
how
where we're going. I think we're going beyond our perception of time, because a lot of things, sound, time, a lot of things that we experience are just our perception of something that we perceive in a particular way. And then we have this agreed thing. I mean, time is not linear, obviously, but we perceive it and have an agreement on it, and an atomic clock to measure it.
Although like I'm sure that, but it's very different. Like, if you were an ancient Aborigine, your view of time was completely different.
Absolutely.
40,000 years could pass, through your lineage, and as though it was just in a moment.
And at the risk of being stepping into a white person talking about an indigenous culture, my understanding is that there was less of an individual consciousness, that it wasn't so much about me. I think part of what Uranus has done is it's forced us to find our distinct individual selves, and that we can be derogative and say that's the ego self or the small self or whatever, but we're going to use that self now, because that's what we're anchoring our experience of the truth in. There's a reason why I'm got this skin and I'm inside it. As my dad said, you've got to have skin to keep your insides in. It's like, I'm in here for a reason. I'm distinct as a person for a reason. And what I need to do now is hold this distinctive self and know how to connect that to other, hubs in the matrix. And that's what makes it all work so beautifully, through having that. So I think that sense of time came through not having an individual. It's like my ancestors come out of, say, my totem is the wallaby. Well, my ancestors are in the wallaby, and when I go back into the wallaby, and the wallaby is everywhere on our country, and so there's a timelessness to that cycle. And so it was a very different story as well about how time worked.
Yeah, and also if I have this wonderful book, collected by a sort of Victorian white woman who lived among the Aboriginal tribes, and collected some of their stories with their permission, some of it because she heard all, you know, she was always hearing, and I read this book to all my children. These stories, they're very short, they're like a page each, and they're very weird and mysterious, and about kind of creatures that are animals that are humans, and they interchange all the time.
Yes.
And they have these little kind of, you know, it always begins in Yaminga times, you know, which is like in the dream time,
in the
ancient times.
Yeah. Well, it's
and
now
then there's,
too.
yes, exactly.
It's all time. Dream time is all time.
Exactly. But it's also humans and animals were very interchangeable.
And rocks and
yes,
everything.
yeah, exactly. So you never kind of knew in the stories what was what, and there was this beautiful floating quality. And I think, you know, that's the kind of magical thinking of us allowing ourselves to be a bit more entangled, you know, with the cosmos, instead of trying to always kind of logically segregate.
Yeah. And so that sense of the segregation being a gift, not intended to imprison or isolate, but a gift of connection.
Exactly.
Which is, I think, part of the 2027 thing, is for us to learn that creation is an us event. Healing is now very much an us event, you know, whereas for a long time it was a very personal journey, but not anymore. We're obviously healing on a collective rather than, well, a little bit still personal, but very much collective now.
Which bring maybe the last thing that we could just touch on is Chiron. Because Chiron's about healing, obviously, and other things, and its return is in 2027, right?
Yeah. Yes. So it was, let me see if I wrote it down. It was discovered on the 1st of November in 1977, and it was in gate 27, which is where I was talking about Uranus was just recently.
Yeah.
And it's going to go back there starting in June 2027 through to April 28. So it'll go
Chiron
over and back
will
again.
complete its first cycle since its discovery in 2027, which is really amazing as well.
Yeah. And
I mean, there's a lot piling up in that year.
Yes. And I mean, Neptune also is going to go into Aries around that time. I've got about, let me see, we've got the full moon on the 22nd of January, which is when Pluto and the Sun are both in gate 41. And then we've got returning to the Uranus discovery position right on the 28th of Feb. And we've got, there's a whole lot of dates in there, including Neptune doing a few things as well. You know, I think it's not like this year, which has this profound, I didn't finish saying, Jupiter and Saturn have been in 61, and they're going to go back as well. So towards the end of October, right on the US election, basically, we have this, like, out of this, I don't even know how to describe what the impact of all of those energies is in that gate. And what we have there as well is a dwarf planet called Albion, which is the zeitgeist shift. And we also have Lempo, and she's about bringing together the masculine and feminine into talking about fire. She's all about returning the fire to humanity, which I think is creativity. So there's a whole lot of dwarf planets lining up with that as well. So it's not going to be like that. This year is tumultuous, but it will be this really profound shift for us to step into that fantasy. And we have to start thinking about this, because Saturn and Jupiter are going to go through there between now and then. We have to start thinking, what do I want to create? If not this, then what? What do I want to create? What kind of world? What can I find in me?
And then we also have to kind of, I guess, you know, there's realms where fantasy can be also delusion.
Yes.
And then there's because I discriminate in language, fantasy from imagination. And because you can get lost in a fantasy.
Yes.
you can kind of ride on the back of imagination, and you know, and but they're intimately linked, aren't they?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a lot of it perhaps is about identification. You know, if you identify with the fantasy, you can get lost in the labyrinth.
I actually
You know what
think
I mean?
Neptune's bringing us to a place where we're going to, and when it gets into Aries, which I'm not sure of the exact date, but maybe 2025. I'm just looking on my note here, but I haven't got it on my note. That what Neptune's doing is teaching us the difference between delusion and active participation in the mystery of creation.
Wonderful.
And that's going to be tough, because we have to let go of our addiction to living in this ideal world where we don't have to actually come down to earth and face those last cellular pieces that are resisting incarnation. Those last bits of our DNA that are like, no,
Yeah.
I didn't want to come here.
Yeah, and that's why I think I said last time, like I like how many times I hear people saying, "This is my last incarnation."
Yeah.
And did I say that last time?
Yeah,
Maybe.
we talked about what that's about.
Yeah, exactly. And so this notion of rebirth is quite connected again, I think.
Yeah.
Like this is like a really exciting time to kind of keep on traveling, you know.
Yeah. And
Keep on
stay
exploring.
calm, and day by day, and what do I want to create? What's the most, the best thing I can imagine? How can I be open to connection?
That's why I've like been like encouraging people to try to just open up the conversation, at least. Like, if you can imagine your future life, the next life, where would it be? Who would it be with? What what might you do? What might you be? What color might you be? I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying, like, open it up. And it feels to me like that's a subject that has fallen so out of vogue, the rebirth subject, but actually to think about it creatively could be really empowering as you're transitioning, as you're dying, to really have already thought it through, and to be in touch with the impulse in you. The imaginative, magical impulse that's like, it's not saying, look, I want to be born there, but it's like, I have a real desire to come back and do something, finish this, maybe carry on the next level of whatever continue. I feel that's like really key.
And I love how it I think getting away from this idea of thinking what we want rather than actually knowing the truth of what's next for us, and that kind of imaginative process is it's what I call emergent leadership, which is that we are what's emerging within us is where each one of us is stepping into a leadership role, not in the old sense, but just in stepping into our full awareness and creativity.
I think it sort of resides in your heart, doesn't it? In the core of your heart, the intelligence of your heart. The intelligence of love that's inside you.
I don't feel it there. I feel it because I've got so much activation in the root and the sacral. I really feel it so much in my root center.
Okay, well, let's say in the heart of your cells, wherever your cells are.
So when you say that, I can feel it right through my whole body.
Yeah, that's really what I mean. When I say heart, that's what I'm referring to. And it is a bit we use that word.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the heart of your being. So what is it like? This is a great question for people to consider. Like, what in the heart of your being, what is your deepest wish for your next phase? And indeed your next life. Like, it's a great question to ask yourself, where would you like to show up? Which culture, which land, which place? In the core, because where is quite important, isn't it? Like, where is is a, you know, where is something you can trust in a way.
Yeah.
And you don't have to have been there before even, but
I'm
it gives you a clue.
I'm in a jungle.
Oh yeah, great.
Yeah, it feels
I'm
nice.
north. I can, you know, I'm in the northern lands.
Yeah,
I really feel that.
nah, too many clothes for me. And just to add to that, I think this imagination thing is really important, because I think that our imaginations, you know, we've been so busy building widgets and trying to succeed by someone else's, you know, definition of what success is, and all this fitting in and everything, and the idea of having the freedom to imagine anything, even if it's magical, even if it, you know, steps outside of the bounds of being realistic. We're so caught up in being realistic now, and realism's being, or what's real is being defined by other people when we should be defining it ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our teenagers are really good at it, aren't they?
Yeah.
You know,
See, that's the thing. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Like, get out of the way and let them get on and build their great new world.
Yeah.
I'm heading to the jungle. Let them get on with it.
Exactly. But then, like, let's not let them lose it. You know, let it be conditioned out of them. You know, which is what often happens in the early 20s. You know, and as you have to sort of get serious and you know, like it's really important that we don't lose those magical threads that we have. You know.
Yeah, and I just want to maybe finish up by coming back to what you said right at the start, which I really loved, is this idea of being playful. You know, playful thinking, playful being, and play is our natural state. So
yeah, and I absolutely, and I want to finish there as well, and by clarifying, like, this, the highest state, you know, that we considered was the non-dual, or someone considered that was the non-dual kind of finished state of
where we cease to exist.
Yeah, for me, even more transcendent than that is to kind of bring all this magical thinking and then bring it in and up and through that state and start again.
Yeah.
You know, and start a new journey that is never ending.
Yeah.
You know, actually.
Yeah.
And you take freedom as your kind of core principle in that journey. You can go in any direction you please in the cosmos.
Yeah.
And whatever you can envision is where you're going to go.
Yeah.
You know, isn't that it?
Yeah, and
that's an even higher state than
Nirvana.
Yeah.
Which I read today, because I actually did some reading on this today, and I read and I made a note here. It says it means blowing out or quenching. So it's like blowing out the life, so you don't have to be reborn anymore, so you don't have any suffering. Released from the cycle of rebirth, and that's what we were talking about. We shouldn't be extinguishing, we should be transforming and moving into the new cycle, and we can only do this if we are, or no, I'm not going to say it that way, I'll say it differently. We do this by learning how to be creators and having the freedom to imagine, where do we want to go next, what do we want to do next, and playing with that seed rather than trying to hold the old pot, the old structure together.
Let it crumble.
Let it crumble, and don't be afraid of it crumbling, because it's actually releasing something that is more vital and more playful than what we have now.
And how rich that compost might be as well.
Oh yeah,
as it
absolutely.
crumbles.
Yes, for sure. Okay, Richard, thank you for that. That was great.
Yeah, brilliant.
And we'll talk again about something else. We'll think something else up.
Yeah. Thanks, Kim. It's great. I love the way your mind works. It's like such a great, boundless way of approaching reality. And
we hit a nice groove, I think, now that we kind of know where we're at a little bit more with each other.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Fantastic.
Great.